It was an ordinary morning in Briar Ridge, a small Virginia town where rolling hills and wide-open fields stretched toward the horizon. Grace awoke before the sun, as she had every day since her parents had passed. The faint light of dawn crept through the farmhouse window, illuminating a single well-worn Bible on her bedside table. Quietly, so as not to disturb her younger siblings, she knelt by her bed and whispered a prayer. "Lord, give me strength to get through another day," she said. "Show me what you want me to do." At 25, Grace was young, but life had hardened her hands and sharpened her resolve. Her mother and father's untimely deaths had left her the head of a household she hadn't asked to lead. While other women her age were busy falling in love or moving to the city, Grace was rising with the chickens, working the fields, and making sure her brother Sam and sister Lily got to school on time. It wasn't that she regretted the responsibility. Her love for Sam and Lily was boundless, but it was easy to feel invisible when her days revolved around chores and caretaking. Sometimes she wondered if her sacrifices even mattered. Did God see her? Did anyone? That Sunday morning, after finishing her farm chores and preparing a simple breakfast of cornbread and eggs, Grace hurried her siblings into their Sunday best and led them down the dusty road to church. The congregation was small and humble. Just a dozen or so families filling the wooden pews. Pastor Elias, an aging man with kind eyes and a soft, steady voice, stepped up to the pulpit. He gave a sermon about the ways God's guidance could be felt in everyday life if only one paid attention. Signs from the Lord don't always come in thunderclaps or burning bush, he said, looking out over the modest congregation. Sometimes they're as quiet as a whisper, as subtle as a shadow at noon. But they are there if you open your heart to see them. Grace sat still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Something about his words stuck with her. The idea that God could be sending her signs small, quiet indicators of what to do, where to go, and who to help struck a chord. All her life she had thought she was simply bearing her burdens alone. But what if those burdens weren't obstacles at all? What if they were part of a divine plan? What if she had been chosen, not because she was strong, but because she was willing? After the service ended, Grace lingered in the sanctuary. Sam and Lily played outside with the other children. But Grace remained, staring up at the simple wooden cross above the pulpit. She thought of all the times she'd been on the verge of giving up, when the rains had ruined the harvest, when there wasn't enough money to pay the electric bill, when Sam got sick and she didn't know how she'd afford the medicine. Each time, something or someone had come through at just the right moment. Was it luck? Or was it something greater? When she walked home that afternoon, her mind raced. She decided to do something new. She would start writing down every moment that felt like a sign. Every instance where help came just in time. Every quiet nudge in her heart to take a certain path. Every unexpected opportunity that felt too perfect to be mere coincidence. Maybe, if she tracked them, she could begin to see a pattern, maybe even find her purpose. Back at the farmhouse, she dug out an old leather-bound journal her mother used to keep recipes in. It was mostly empty now, with only a few scribbled notes from years ago. Grace picked up her pen, her hand steady, and wrote the date at the top of the first page. Underneath, she wrote, "Today, Pastor Elias spoke of God's signs. I've decided to pay closer attention. What if these struggles, these little moments of relief, are God's way of showing me the way forward?" She closed the journal, feeling both nervous and excited. This was the first step of something she didn't fully understand, but something that felt right. For the first time in a long time, she had a sense of hope, like she was on the brink of uncovering something extraordinary. The hills of Briar Ridge seemed just a little brighter as Grace went about her evening chores. The cows still needed milking, the wood stove still needed stoking, and her siblings still needed tucking into bed. But as the last light of day faded, and she sat in the quiet kitchen with her journal before her, Grace felt that faintest hint of something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. Grace's days continued much as before, early mornings filled with chores. Long hours tending the farm and quiet evenings at the kitchen table with Sam and Lily. But something had changed within her. Keeping the journal transformed the way she saw her life. Every time she opened it, she was reminded to watch for signs, to notice the moments when God's grace seemed to peek through the cracks of her day-to-day struggles. It began with little things. One morning, the old hen who hadn't laid an egg in months left a perfect brown egg in the nest. It was a small mercy, a single egg in the vast scheme of her responsibilities, but Grace wrote it down anyway. A reminder that even what seems lost can still bear fruit, she thought. Then there were other moments, like the kind neighbor who stopped by with extra seed just as she was about to plant, or the sudden patch of sunshine that dried out the fields after a heavy rain. These weren't miracles in the traditional sense, but they felt like whispers from above, encouraging her to keep moving forward. Word of Grace's steady determination and quiet acts of kindness began to spread around Briar Ridge. People who once kept to themselves now found their way to her door. Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly widow who lived on the outskirts of town, knocked one afternoon and asked Grace to help repair her broken fence. Grace didn't think twice. She grabbed her tools and walked the mile to Mrs. Jenkins's property, fixing the fence boards while the older woman offered her homemade biscuits and lemonade. As they worked, Mrs. Jenkins shared stories about her late husband, her younger days, and her faith in God's timing. "Child, sometimes it's not about waiting for a grand miracle," she said. "It's about being there, doing the small, good thing that keeps someone going another day. That's a sign, too." Grace thought about those words as she walked home that evening. The signs she was writing down weren't just events. They were calls to action, nudges to keep showing up for others. Maybe that's why people kept finding her. Soon, her siblings began to thrive in ways that left Grace in awe. Sam, who had struggled with his studies, suddenly found his footing. Grace spent time helping him with his math problems each night, and after weeks of persistence, he brought home his first A. "See, Sam," she said, smiling at him over the dinner table. "Hard work pays off." She wrote the moment in her journal, noting how patience and fate had turned frustration into success. Lily, always shy and unsure of herself, began playing the old upright piano at the church. Grace encouraged her to practice, even if she missed a few notes. One Sunday, Lily played so beautifully that Pastor Elias thanked her in front of the entire congregation. The look of pride on Lily's face was a sign Grace couldn't miss. For Grace, the journal entries became a source of strength. Each day brought new struggles, but they also brought new signs, subtle reminders that God's hand was present. They reassured her when she doubted herself, gave her hope when she felt like giving up, and slowly, quietly, helped her believe that perhaps she was meant for something greater. As her siblings grew stronger and her neighbors turned to her for guidance, she began to see her role in the community differently. She wasn't just holding the farm together. She was helping others in ways she hadn't realized before. Grace still didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what God's full plan for her life might be. But as she flipped through the pages of her journal one evening, looking back at the entries she'd written over the months, she saw a pattern. The first signs were small, but they were steady. They were preparing her heart, showing her how faith, kindness, and quiet determination could leave an impact greater than she ever imagined. Tasks you said. One crisp autumn morning, the skies above Briar Ridge were heavy with dark, brooding clouds. Rain was forecast, but no one could have predicted the storm that arrived that afternoon. By evening, torrential rains had swollen the creeks into raging rivers, sweeping away fences and drowning fields. Grace stood at her kitchen window, watching as the water rose past the fence line of her property. Sam and Lily sat nervously at the table, their unfinished homework forgotten. As the rain continued to pour, Grace's thoughts turned to her neighbors. Many of the homes in Briar Ridge were closer to the valley floor, low-lying and vulnerable. Grace knew from past floods that these families would be struggling, perhaps stranded. Her own farm, while battered by the storm, sat on higher ground. "We need to do something," she said. turning to her siblings. "Sam, Lily helped me clear space in the barn." The two didn't hesitate. Together they moved bales of hay, cleared tools from the barn's loft, and dragged spare cots down from the attic. Grace lit lanterns and gathered extra blankets, preparing for the possibility of housing people overnight. She sent Sam to check on the older couple down the road, who might need help reaching safer ground, and instructed Lily to ready some food supplies as night fell. The first family arrived, a mother and her two children, soaked and shivering. Soon after, another couple knocked on the door, their house completely flooded. Word spread quickly. By dawn, Grace's barn was filled with nearly 24 neighbors, all seeking refuge from the storm's wrath. Grace moved among them with quiet determination. She passed out warm bowls of soup, found dry clothes for those in need, and kept the younger children entertained by telling stories. Her siblings helped where they could, but it was Grace who took the lead, calming fears, coordinating resources, and ensuring everyone had a safe place to rest. After the rain finally stopped, the waters began to recede, leaving behind a landscape of ruin. Crops were destroyed, roads were washed out, and some homes were damaged beyond repair. Yet, as the sun broke through the clouds, Grace's barn remained a symbol of hope. Her neighbors, who had always known her as the quiet, self-reliant farmer's daughter, now saw her in a different light. She had become their anchor during the storm. It wasn't long after the flood that word of Grace's efforts reached the ears of someone unexpected. Denzel Washington was in a nearby city on a charitable visit when he heard about the young woman who had turned her farm into a refuge for her entire community. Intrigued, he decided to make the short trip to Briar Ridge to meet her in person. When Denzel arrived at the farm, he found Grace in her barn, helping a neighbor repair a damaged wagon. He introduced himself humbly, shaking Grace's hand and thanking her for what she had done. Grace, always modest, downplayed her role. "I just did what anyone would do," she said. But Denzel shook his head. "No, Grace, not everyone would have done what you did. In the face of that storm, you didn't just take care of yourself, you took care of everyone else. That's not just good fortune or circumstance, that's calling. God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. And you've been answering that call every day." His words struck Grace deeply. For months, she had been writing down the signs, quietly wondering if they meant something bigger. Now, here was someone she had never met, someone respected and wise, affirming what she had only dared to hope was true, that her small acts of kindness, her persistence through hardship, and her willingness to serve were all part of a divine plan. Denzel stayed at the farm for several hours, talking with Grace and the family, still picking up the pieces after the flood. He spoke to the group, reminding them that God's chosen are often those who quietly carry others through the storm. "It's not about being seen," he said. "It's about showing up." And that's exactly what Grace has done. She's shown up over and over. As Denzel prepared to leave, he shook Grace's hand once more. "Keep listening," he said. "The signs are all around you." That night, after the barn had quieted and her neighbors had gone home, Grace sat at her kitchen table with her journal. She flipped back through the pages, reading over the moments she had recorded, the unexpected rain that saved her crops, the neighbor who brought seed when she needed it most, the smiles on Sam and Lily's faces as they found their own paths. Now, she added the flood to the list, not just the disaster, but the way it had revealed her ability to lead and comfort others in times of crisis. Denzel's visit had confirmed something she had been feeling all along. These signs were not just coincidences. They were guideposts, affirmations that God had a purpose for her. Grace closed the journal and whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she wouldn't face it alone. The floodwaters eventually dried up, but the impression Grace left on Briar Ridge remained. The families who had sought shelter in her barn spoke often about her calm, steadfast presence and her seemingly endless supply of hope. Word spread beyond the town, and more people began to take notice of Grace. not just for her selflessness, but for the way she seemed to radiate a quiet, unshakable faith. Grace continued her days as she always had, rising early, working the land, and caring for Sam and Lily. But now she moved through her routines with a deeper sense of purpose. She didn't have to seek recognition or acknowledgement. In her heart, she understood that being chosen by God didn't mean life was easier or more glamorous. It meant living each day with intention, serving others, and trusting that even the smallest actions could have a ripple effect. Her journal became a sacred space. Each night, after the day's work was done, she'd sit at her kitchen table and write. Sometimes it was a brief note about a moment of kindness she witnessed. Other times, she reflected on challenges that had turned out to be blessings in disguise. Over time, she began to see a larger pattern in the signs she recorded. Each one seemed to draw her closer to her community, her family, and her faith. Pastor Elias noticed the change in her as well. One Sunday after church, he pulled her aside. "Grace," he said, his voice kind, "do you know why people are drawn to you?" She smiled shyly and shook her head. "I'm not sure they are, Pastor. I just do what needs to be done." He nodded. "You don't realize it, but that's exactly why. You don't seek attention or reward. You show up day after day, and you live your faith without fanfare. People see that. They see the quiet strength God has placed in you, and they find hope in it." Grace thought about his words long after their conversation. She began to understand that being chosen by God wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about doing grand, showy deeds. It was about following where he led her, one step at a time, and trusting that he would use her efforts, even the small ones, to make a difference. Over time, Grace's farm became more than a source of food. It became a source of inspiration. People from neighboring towns would stop by to ask her advice on farming or to talk about their struggles. Grace never turned them away. She listened, shared her own experiences, and encouraged them to look for the signs of God's presence in their lives. Her words were simple but powerful, and they often left people feeling renewed. Denzel Washington stayed in touch, occasionally sending her books, notes of encouragement, or a kind word through mutual acquaintances. He continued to share Grace's story during his motivational speeches, not to put her on a pedestal, but to remind others of the profound impact one person's faith and kindness could have on an entire community. Grace never let the attention go to her head. She remained focused on her work, her family, and her quiet walk with God. Years passed, and Briar Ridge continued to change. Sam grew up, excelling in school and eventually becoming a teacher in the same town where Grace had once helped him with his math homework. Lily, inspired by Grace's steadfast support, pursued her love of music and became the church's permanent organist, her talents bringing comfort and joy to countless Sunday services. In Grace, she kept walking in faith, one step at a time. She never stopped writing in her journal, and those pages told the story of a woman who didn't need a grand calling card to know she was chosen. Each entry, whether it was about a neighbor's smile, a moment of answered prayer, or a flood that brought a town together, reminded her of the quiet, steady work of God in her life. It reminded her that even though she might never fully understand the scope of his plan, she could trust that her small acts of faithfulness were part of something greater. As she looked back over the years, Grace realized that the divine signs were never about pointing to her. They were about pointing her and everyone she touched toward God. She had learned that being chosen didn't mean being better than others. It meant being willing to trust, willing to serve, and willing to walk the path God set before her.